Greetings! In today's video, I'm going to be talking to you about cars, about all of the weird methods that I've been using to create the shapes that I want to create, and hopefully this can give you ideas of how to make cars on your own or how not to make cars on your own, because a lot of the things I do are basically war crimes. So the first two things I'm going to show you are the main chassis from which I generally build cars, and then one of the very old examples of how one of my cars are. And then we're going to go on to the weird experimentation that I've been doing in the past couple weeks to build newer and probably worse cars, because I've been doing very strange things. All right, so the first war crime that we're going to talk about is piston glitching your suspension and your wheels into the body like this. You should not do this. Under no circumstances should you ever do this. The reason I do it is because I like my wheels to be very close inside the wheel wells, and that allows it. Basically, if you just simply attach the suspension straight to the body and then make it really weak, you can achieve a similar result, but not nearly as good as this. And as you accelerate or decelerate, the distance between the wheel and the wheel well will change drastically if your suspension is really weak. Instead, in this case, because the suspension is quite stiff, it means that the distance between the wheel and the wheel well doesn't change very drastically, and it remains consistent over different speeds and accelerations. Another thing to note is the hinge over here, making this front of the bumper hinge downward. And obviously the degrees on this are 7 at the moment. Depending on how long the front is or what shape I'm going for the front of my car, the angle on this will change from 5 degrees to 12 degrees or whatever it may be. Moving to the back side is this piston pulling down the canopy from the top, which allows me to not have to worry about too many attachment points within the canopy, and I can build whatever size I want, whatever length I want, and simply just piston it down without having to worry about whether it's colliding with the seats, because it could just go through them. So moving on to this, I have obviously front is hinged down, top pistoned down, wheels pistoned up, and at the back I have some creation of slightly complex shapes by taking wedges and pistoning rounded corners into them. That's how I create some complex shapes in the rear of the car, or I use hinges back here, or I simply just build out with regular blocks how I want the rear of the car to look. And then headlights. Generally, on most of my cars, I will have actual headlamps hidden on the inside of the hood of the car, and I will have mock headlights created with whatever combination of glowing and decal on it. So, first car is this car. This is my second attempt at changing the way that I hinge the front of my car. Everything is mostly the same. The back is mainly built out with blocks. Suspension and wheels are pistoned up. These two hinges over here and over here make it so that these two power coupling sections of the car are how I would build a hood usually. And then there's this part where I have a hinge inside here that pulls the rest of the hood down almost 90 degrees. There is an advantage to this, because the minimum setting on a steering hinge is 5 degrees, right? But if you do it the other way and go almost to 90 degrees, you can go to 89.9 degrees if you want. Which means that the minimum range on the steering hinge is more limiting than the maximum range, because I can tune this to within 3 degrees of 90. Or 2 degrees or 1 degree. The flaw of this, on the other hand, is this. When I'm doing it in the regular way, it means that the maximum height of the hood, where the windshield starts, is 1 block high. which means that it's always going to be in line 1 block high with the rear of the car if I want that to be the case. Whereas at the front of the car, if I'm hinging from here, it means that the minimum height at the front of the car is going to be 1 block high, and the back of the hood is going to be higher than 1 block. And that means that essentially from the front of the car, where the hood meets the windshield, to the back of the car, there's a discrepancy of height. And that's an issue that comes essentially with how the thing is built. Another issue that comes with how this is built is when I'm putting a hinge in here, there's no way to hide it if it's folding 90 degrees to the back. So I have 2 exposed hinges at the front of my car, and there's not much I can do about that. There are ways to mitigate it. On this replica I made of the Toyota Land Cruiser, I put shield pieces on the bumper of the car. So the way that this is built is that the hood of the car hinges downward and the bumper of the car hinges upward on 2 different sets of hinges. So there's a hinge here for the hood and there's a hinge here for the bumper. That means that on the bumper, I can add these 2 shield blocks, and when everything folds up, the shield blocks partially cover the fact that there's 2 exposed hinges on the hood. But that's not a strategy that I can employ everywhere because not all cars will have these more elaborate or pronounced bumpers. The next car that I attempted to experiment with is this. Full disclosure, this is a flying car. This is not a regular car. This does fly, however, it does drive on the road as any regular car does. And then when it transitions into flight, it has roll, yaw, and pitch as a spaceship or hovercraft would. But when you're on the road, it drives regularly. Also, its wheels have a lot of issues existing because it's a flying car and I tried everything, but it's okay. The 2 main things, actually 3 main things to be concerned about with this is because of the many things I had to do to make this thing fly, the canopy could not piston glitch farther down into the body than exactly how far I got it. I played around with a bunch of numbers and I couldn't get it any further down without it completely exploding. And so I tried, perhaps badly, to implement these 2 wedges at the front in order to give it a more smooth transition rather than just not a transition at all. But it's kind of weird and strange. Then we go to the front where I have these 4 headlamps and I have glass pieces with decals over them. And thanks to the hood being hinged down in my traditional way, I have basically encased partially the headlamps in glass. Partially and badly. They do work, just I wish it was cleaner. And then for the back of the car, I have, again, creation of complex shapes. I have a steering hinge that hinges down 90 degrees with this 4x1 wedge. And then I have a rounded and 2 wedges, which creates this weird shape at the back of the car just above the wheel. The problem with that is that, again, this steering hinge leaves a gap over here, which has to be filled in with a different steering hinge that pushes a wedge down above the gap so that it doesn't just leave a hole there where the steering hinge is supposed to be. And none of this is done particularly well. So we will move on to this 3rd vehicle. This is more of an SUV type. Going back briefly to this Toyota Land Cruiser replica, its wheels are slightly too small. Essentially, it's either I shrink the entire vehicle down by like 1 block per side, and then the vehicle becomes too small, and I don't have as much freedom with all of the details that I wanted to put in, or I have to live with the fact that the wheels are just slightly small and I can put in all of the details. Also, the amount of hinge glitching that I did on this thing to make it work, war crimes is the word that you should use, and probably do not imitate if you want a stable vehicle. But from here, this is the first time I pistoned wheels in from the side rather than from the bottom, because it's a SUV type vehicle, and so it likes more suspension travel and it likes to be able to take bumps better. And it's not as concerned with the wheels being all the way inside the wheel wells. So moving on to this SUV, suspension and then pistons pulling the wheels in from the side. And on top of that, other pistons pulling the wheel wells in from the side, which creates a bunch of problems with collisions. But on this build, I could just work around them. And as you can see, I created like different shapes on the canopy and hood to ensure that the wheel wells on the side getting piston glitched in wouldn't collide with anything and make the car unhappy. The unfortunate part is because the suspension is a little bit higher off the ground and it's a little bit top heavy, I couldn't get this not to roll over, and so I had to add in the usual distance sensors plus gyro combo so that it could essentially move around without rolling over like an armadillo. Other than that, hood hinge glitched down from the front rather than in my traditional manner, and I just have to live with the two hinges being exposed at the front. The other thing to note is that this distance sensor was giving me a bunch of trouble, as whenever I spawned the vehicle in, it was a complete coin flip whether it would be on or off. So when the hood is folding down, it turns on for a second and then it turns off. And that I'm pretty sure is because I had these hinges act without a delay. The distance sensor would sometimes just remain on for the duration of the vehicle's existence. And so I introduced a short delay in here to make sure that every time the vehicle spawned in, it would trigger the distance sensor and then allow it to turn itself off as the hood came down. And then we can move on to the final vehicle, which is the most war crime. Because as you can probably see, I chose to take the wheel wells and the wheels and suspension complex and the entire thing from the SUV that I just showed you and transfer it onto a more regular chassis. This creates all sorts of issues for me. First off, because I can't use full blocks over here, I have to use wedges so that it won't collide with this wedge when it's pistoning in, because otherwise it will absolutely murder everything. The second issue is at the front, where the hood is hinge glitched downwards by this hinge, and then I have the side piston glitching inward, which collides, and it's completely unhappy. It's never happy with existing. The other thing to note is, I couldn't figure out why, by the way, on this car, I mean, you can see it. Like, look at this. I'm just steering regularly with my A and D keys, and this is what it does. So the solution to that, and I couldn't tell you why this works, but this is the solution. You take 1x1 tube and then you connect the two sides of the suspension to each other so that they don't move independently. And then I like to turn this tube to glass so that it's not in the way all the time. And now I can drive the car like a regular human being without it freaking out on me. Needless to say, this car also has a gyro in it for obvious reasons. There's so many hinge and piston glitches in here. It just continued to turn over and flip over and roll around like a ball, which, you know, is not fun when you're trying to drive. And one of the cool things on this car is that I added in an engine window. The engine window used to look really different than this. It used to have the 2x2 wedges at the back, and then I had this part essentially covered with shields that were turned to glass and then decaled over to create a separate window for the engine than the living area of the inside of the vehicle. And then I was reprimanded by my friends telling me that that's not how engine windows on cars work, and that I should change it so that it's more sensible and less nonsensical. And so I did. And so that's what it looks like now. And yeah, this car, the only reason it exists, or that it continues to exist, is because of the gyro and the much assistance that it imposes on the car to not flip over constantly. Yeah. One of the cool parts, though, of having piston glitched the sides in is that I get to add in this shield and this tail light, which I've painted glowing red and then decaled over, and that creates a very nice little greeble for the car. But other than that, that's the car. Closing thoughts? Don't use pistons on suspension or on wheels if you want your car to drive well. The reason that I do, I have this piston here, and you know, on other cars, and these cars have pistons on like pushing the things up. It's like all of these are very bad ideas for performance, but I just can't sacrifice the aesthetics because I'm addicted or something. But if you want your car to perform well, don't use piston glitches, I beg of you. That's my advice. I cannot help it, but that's my advice. And there you go. That has been my short showcase of how I've been building cars and the different techniques and strategies that I've been experimenting with, committing war crimes with, doing all sorts of weird things with, to create sometimes better results, sometimes less good results than bad results. A lot of weird, I don't know how I feel about this results, and a lot of umming and ahhing about what's good and what's not good. Yeah, I hope you've learned something about Trailmakers build technique and what not to do. I hope you've enjoyed. Thank you for watching. And I will see you in the future.